okay, I'm going to accompany you. I'm going to stand right next to you because you're going to talk into.
Since 1978, David Denby has been a critic for the New York Magazine, a film critic. He went back 30 years later to Columbia University, his alma mater, to retake the Great Books courses, the process of which led him to write his new book, The Great Books. And we are thrilled and delighted to have him here with us today. His book covers all kinds of wonderful things from the culture wars and multiculturalism to personal revelations, and I hope you all enjoy it today.
Thanks. Thank you all for coming. I have to tell you that this whole thing got started because my wife told me to put up or shut up. That's the truth. It was back there in 1989 or 90 in there somewhere, and the two of us, we live in New York and Manhattan, we're reading the Culture Wars debate, which now seems to have lasted longer than the War of the Roses, and getting increasingly dismayed by the whole thing. It seems terribly hollow and ideological in the worst way to both of us. On the academic left, we had a great many people writing and talking about the classics of the Western tradition in philosophy, literature, political theory, so on, as if they empowered white males only and disempowered everyone else in our culture. And on the right, people like Lynn Cheney and William Bennett, although saying some good things about the centrality of the humanities in any person's life, also spoke of literature and philosophy in ways that made it sound somehow essential to the national defense, rather like Star Wars. And I thought this was Philistine in a different way. What do you actually get out of reading a representative selection of such books, I thought, and my wife thought? What does it mean to read Montaigne or Kant or Hegel or Shakespeare or Plato or Virginia Woolf or whoever? Can anyone who, and particularly 18 and 19-year-olds reading these books, are they really going to think this way, talk this way? Are they going to be affected in this way, in either of these ways? So on and on I went, descanting on these themes to the point at which my wife, Kathy Shine, who's also a writer, a novelist, said, you know, I've had enough of this. Why don't you do something about it? Go back to school. Columbia is not very far away. We live at 76th Street in West End. Columbia is only a couple miles north on Manhattan. Back to your undergraduate college. They have still their required courses in Western classics. They've undergone very little change, as it turns out. Well, so I'll tell you about that, some change. And it's not the only university that still has them as required courses. The University of Chicago has them. Many other universities have different versions of them. Some have them as elective courses, but not required. Certainly there are many fewer of such courses than there were 30 years ago. And the two courses are Literature Humanities, as it's called. It was started in 1937 by a man named John Erskine. It grew out of an honors course. And it starts with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and goes right up to either Joyce or Virginia Woolf. 30 years ago, we finished with James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now we finish with To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. So there's a shift in taste right there that you can see. The other one is called Contemporary Civilization, and it is a classics of social theory, political theory course, and it starts with Plato's Republic, which we read in its entirety, and goes right up to some contemporary political theory. The whole point is to throw the students in. You're thrown into that swimming pool, you know, and you learn to swim that way. There isn't a lot of context. There are no lectures. It's all taught in sections. There are 43, I think, sections of each course. You can be taught by anything from a professor who's been there for 30 years and has tenure to a graduate student in the third year of her time there who's writing her dissertation on 16th century Burgundy or something. And I don't mean to imply that the professors are necessarily better teachers than the young graduate students. Sometimes the graduate students get the bit between their teeth and are wonderful. It's a hard course to teach because you are dealing with a major text each week. It's hard for the students, it's hard for the teachers. So Kathy and I thought, well, it would make a nice magazine article. Film critic goes back to school. There was a nice, easy hook for it, as we say in journalism. You know, what's the hook? Well, 5 years and 200,000 words later, hook, line, and sinker, I would say, I got caught up in something that was much larger than myself, and perhaps larger than the culture wars debate. Something else was going on in me, personally, that I didn't quite realize at the time. Now, I'm going to switch here and start reading from the introduction. I have been a journalist all my life, a film critic since 1969, and I enjoy magazine writing very much. But by the early 90s, I was beginning to be sick at heart. Sick not of movies or movie criticism, but of living my life inside what the French philosopher Guy Debord has called the society of the spectacle, that immense system of representations, the thick atmosphere of information and imagery and attitudes that forms the mental condition and habits of almost any adult living in a media society in the late 20th century. A member of the media, I was also tired of the media. I was more than uneasy in that veil of shadows, that frenetic but gloomy half-life, filled with names, places, chatter, acts, cars racing, gunshots, experts talking, daytime couples accusing one another of infidelity, the sheer busyness of it all, the constant movement, the incredible activity and utter boredom, the low hum of needs being satisfied, though not my needs. The media give information, but information in the 1990s has become transitory and unstable. Once in place, it immediately gets pulled apart. The fragments upgraded, the rest hustled off the stage. No one's information is ever quite adequate, which is one reason among many that some Americans now seem half mad with anxiety and restlessness. Like many others, I was jaded yet still hungry. I was cast into the modern state of living in the media, a state of excitement needled with disgust. At the end of the century, the media threatened to take over altogether and push literature out of sight. And my disgust was tinged with intense emotions I couldn't quite pin down. Nostalgia, regret, anger, even despair. I needed to start work on this book, I realized, in part because I no longer knew what I knew. I felt that what I had read or understood was slipping away. I possessed information without knowledge, opinions without principles, instincts without beliefs. The foundations of the building were turning to sand while I sat in the upper balconies looking out at the sea. Feeling the wiggle, I knew I was in trouble. I sensed my identity had softened and merged into the atmosphere of representation, and I couldn't quite see where it ended and I began. My own memories were lapsing out into the fog of media life, the unlived life as spectator. Perhaps the professional movie critic, as he ages, undergoes a special anxiety, though I don't think so. We are all movie critics. I just happen to write down and publish my opinions. Everyone lives in the media. Now, reading the great books may seem an odd solution to a midlife crisis or a crisis of identity or whatever it was that was happening. Why not travel or hunt elephants? Chase teenage girls? Live in a monastery? These, I believe, are the traditional methods, for men at least, of dealing with such problems. But if I wanted adventure, I wanted it in a way that made sense for me. Reading seriously, I thought, might be one way of ending my absorption in media life, a way of finding the edges again. Now, I will be the first to admit this is a thoroughly ambivalent project because I never gave up movie criticism. I continued to review movies for New York Magazine week in and week out with only a few short leaves, and as I was up at Columbia for that year, and the year was 91, 92. I sat in these classes. I selected some teachers. I had a compositional problem, which is I wanted to get some variety of approach, so I moved around a little bit, but I settled down after a while into two sections of the literature course. Professor Taylor, who has been teaching it as well as many other courses on and off for 30 years and has the whole thing in his head. It's like a gigantic epic poem, starting with the first line of Homer and ending with Virginia Woolf. And he uses the Socratic method in class, puts people on the spot, plays off points of view against one another, identifies individual students as experts in a certain kind of reading after he gets a successful answer out of them. And sort of builds a kind of reading ego in them. He's half charlatan, half genius, like all great teachers. The other literature teacher was James Shapiro, a much younger man, Shakespeare scholar, who does something entirely different. He has a kind of mock, naive approach. He asks them at the beginning of each week whether they liked the book. Do you like it? And some of the answers he gets are very naive or unformed or callow. These are 18-year-olds, after all, who have not read a great deal of literature. I'm sorry to say, less than we freshmen had read 30 years ago when I was first at Columbia in 1961. Then he takes their responses, opens them up, turns them against the students in some cases, provokes them, teases them, and we begin to get to something real after a while. My CC teacher, contemporary civilization teacher, was a Swede named Anders Stevenson, who comes out of the Swedish socialist tradition, and I wanted him, I knew about him, I'd heard him speak a couple of times, because I thought, here's my academic leftist, and he'll give me the talk from that point of view. He turned out to be delightfully counter-cliche, and certainly has no opposition to these kinds of courses which have been denounced in other circles as elitist, and so on. Up I went, and I was determined to sit there and take notes, sort of fade into the walls like a good reporter. I had my little steno notebook, and I found myself incapable of keeping my mouth shut. Call on me. Now, I didn't do this in Professor Taylor's class because, as I said, he has the whole thing in his head. You can't really answer in any way except the way he's directing you to answer. But in the other two sections, I did, and Stephenson even referred to my obnoxious hand-raising as interventions, which I later found out is an academic term in the current jargon, meaning something that changes the situation. He encouraged me to intervene, and so did Shapiro for a while. Now, I had a lot of difficulties at first, I have to tell you. We began with the Iliad, which of course I had read 30 years earlier, a 15,693-line poem. I think I've got the numbers right. And I discovered that my concentration, well, I knew this already, but trying to read the Iliad really dramatized it. My concentration wasn't what it was, or anything like. When I was 16, say, I had, like many of you, I'm sure, a very intimate relationship with literature at that age. I read a lot. I remember sitting on the bed in my parents' apartment in New York, reading maybe Dickens for a couple of hours, then looking up and seeing an Afghan that my grandmother had knitted. Oh, there's a red thread, there's a green thread, there's a red thread, there's a green thread. Okay, back to the book. That was my break. Now I'm bounding up out of my seat after 20 minutes or 25, and my unconscious is interrupting whatever it is I'm reading. Little imps come up from below and break my concentration. Partly, I suppose, it's because that much more water has flowed under the bridge. I have a normally complicated middle-class life, very interesting wife, 2 children, multiple job obligations, no more than anyone else, but active. And there's a lot going on that interrupts. The children themselves, of course, interrupt. One thing I can tell you, if you don't know already, is that in an American family, a man at home alone reading is not a person to be respected. I was chased from room to room, from the study where the children would find me to the living room, from the living room to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the nanny's room where I would sit like an adulterous husband on her bed with underwear sitting around me reading the Confessions of St. Augustine. I don't mean to make it sound as if we have some vast apartment. The rooms are actually rather small. Anyway, Columbia took pity on me and gave me an office under the roof in Hamilton Hall, one of the old undergraduate instruction buildings. I read in subways. I read standing up the way a horse sleeps. I read in doctor's offices when the children were being examined or while they were having their baths. I mean, you can't, you know, I would stand in the subway and people were reading John Grisham on all sides of me. Grisham actually works very well in the New York subway because you get that click, click, click from the wheels going over the rails, and it propels the plots along even faster than they're already going. You cannot read Plato, however. I realized I was carrying the books around as a kind of talisman, you know, to ward off evil, and wasn't accomplishing much. Well, there were many differences between the way I read and the way the freshmen and sophomores read. Generally, freshmen take the literature course, sophomores take the contemporary civilization or social theory course. And I noticed when we got to Oedipus Rex in the literature course, Sophocles' great tragedy, that I developed a peculiar cough. It's one of those coughs you have, you know, when you're not really ill and you're coughing anyway. Kind of an itch at the bottom of your throat. The students had troubles too, of a different sort. So here we are in my Sophocles chapter. And the plan here, but just before I read, is there are 28 chapters and each centered on a given author. I go back and forth between the two choruses and take you through the whole year in chronological, more or less chronological order. I shuffled it a little bit just for dramatic effect. So you could follow my adventure from beginning to end. You can also ignore the chronological order if you want and read the chapters in any order that pleases you. Let's go see what this guy has to say about Marx. You know, jump that way, or all right, well now I'll go back to Plato, or now I'll go ahead to Jane Austen. It doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned. I tried to make each chapter a standalone episode as well as part of this narrative. So here we are in Oedipus Rex, and quote, he didn't know he was killing his father. Now Oedipus, as you remember, commits unwittingly and unknowingly, but not entirely innocently, commits horrifying crimes, kills his father, sleeps with his mother, and marries her. Hence the Oedipus complex that you've heard about so much. In Shapiro's second class on Oedipus, Rebecca, the woman who got red when she spoke and who twisted her hands together, was talking of the king. She was a liberal Jewish girl from the Midwest, strenuous in her sense of fairness, a morally armed and fortified reader. Her hair was pulled away tautly from her face and held at the back by a small red band. And occasionally, when just listening, she would suddenly remove the band, pitching her hair forward, her head down as if bowing before some jealous god. Then she would put her hands in the hair, fingers spread out, and pull the hair taut again, refastening the band at the back. She was a teacher's dream. Shapiro's dream, anyway. I could see that because she experienced books in an intensely personal way. She might say foolish things, but she did not hold back. And now she was trying to make it come out right, and saying, in effect, that Oedipus couldn't be held responsible for the death of his father. For Rebecca and for students in other classes I heard discussing the play, Oedipus was a mere victim of the god Apollo's malicious plan. For them, Oedipus was not free not to kill his father and marry his mother. The interlocking prophecies, they thought, rendered the play morally invalid. True Americans, they were used to the claims of victimization, but had trouble comprehending a man who was destroyed partly through his own greatness. The Greeks didn't necessarily think that Oedipus was innocent, however, and Oedipus himself makes no effort to exonerate himself, not in this play, at any rate. That the gods had chosen him to suffer meant for the Greeks that he was in some way guilty. Oedipus was the kind of man who would do what he was fated to do. The gods weren't quite as arbitrary as Rebecca thought. And Sophocles gives him freedom enough, even though fated to kill his father, he acts freely from one moment to the next, choosing to kill the irascible old man and his party at the crossroads. The play was a long way from us. The whole sickly, self-pitying side of modern life, especially American life, with its feel-good therapies, its euphemisms, its self-transformation movements, its insistent cry of victimization as if everyone were a victim, as if life made you a victim. All of this was calculated, consciously or not, to avoid precisely the moment of knowing who you are and what you have done and what you are responsible for. They were American teenagers, Shapiro's students, and that kind of tragedy, not entirely your fault, but not quite an accident either, was not yet part of their understanding of how life worked. They localized and dismissed it as fate, a trick played on human beings by old, dead gods. In real life, they intimated you could ace out the world once you figured out how it worked, or barring that, you could work things out. American life, the students thought, was not fair, but it could be improved through reason and compassion. The play, on the other hand, was beyond reason and compassion. Like my sons, Max and Tommy, these are real names, the students' names are all pseudonymous. They were children of the media, and I got the sense that for them an identity was provisional. Everything could be taken back. The media had tricked them out of facing what young people in all societies have not wanted to face, that you make certain choices that you can't go back on. That identity itself is a kind of fate. You were one person and not another person. They had a fate, these students, each one of them. Now, Oedipus is peremptory, but neither corrupt nor criminal. He's not merely insensible, either like Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, who believed to the end that the people of his country loved him, and who, upon hearing his death sentence from the Bolsheviks, exclaimed, "What? What?" Poor Tsar. "I don't get your question," George Bush said in the second presidential debate of 1992 to the African-American woman who asked him if the national debt had affected him personally. Oedipus gets the questions. He gets all the questions. You may recall he he assumes the throne by solving the riddle of the Sphinx. If you don't solve it, you get devoured. Smart and tough, and he's flexible enough to share power, at least nominally, with his wife and her brother. Among other reasons, because it's desire. This in a personal way than I'd expected. Now, at the climax of the play, Oedipus at last finds out the truth that he is the one who has committed these acts. I mean, he doesn't know the man he killed was his father, and so on, or that the woman he married was his mother. And he blinds himself. That is, he sees at last and he puts out his eyes. Appalling paradox of Sophocles. Blindness, not fate, is the organizing metaphor of Oedipus. Blindness, first metaphorical and then literal, in a powerful and successful middle-aged man. Blindness cutting him off from knowledge despite his very drive for knowledge. That was the thing, rasping at my unconscious as I was reading, the sense that the drive for success and dominance, my drive, by its very nature, contains within it the danger of insensibility. In the very act of succeeding at anything, you may cut yourself off from some vital part of yourself, and that part could destroy you. Now, how could an 18-year-old know that? Well, of course, the answer is they can't, and they may find it out. Perhaps they won't, and will be very, very lucky. Now, by telling you this or reading you this anecdote, I don't mean to suggest that the advantage of 30 years or that the difference of 30 years was always to my advantage. And there were occasions, certainly, when, with some ruefulness, I realized that the students were reading better than I was. They're very good at abstract texts, difficult texts, like German philosophy, Kant, and Hegel. They also were good, and when we got to the book of Job, also the first semester, mighty biblical poem from the Old Testament, and Job, you recall, is this prosperous man who suffers terribly from a wager between God and Satan, or what the Old Testament calls Satan, the King James translation. Will Job give up his belief if he is very, very severely tested? And he loses almost everything. And the students, in the beginning of the Professor Shapiro, Professor Shapiro's class made some pious, I thought, and fairly timid remarks, and I was angry at them because I thought they have no sense of what Job has lost. And I was upset reading this great poem, as well as tremendously excited and pleased by the language of it and the extraordinary vehemence of it and beauty of it. I was upset because I was thinking of friends who had died of AIDS, young, or another film critic I knew who had died in a freak automobile accident, friends downsized out of jobs, in other words, people who had undergone some fate like Job's, and I had fantasies of the roof falling in on my family. But as I listened to the students, in class, I think it was by then the second class on Job, I began to get a little bit embarrassed off on my corner because I thought, well, you know, I'm misreading it, the mature householder. I'm reading it in a narrowly material way. This great biblical poem should not induce self-pity, which was what I was feeling. If anything, it should be a call to the most resolute courage, whether you're a believer or not, to face your life and its unexpected tragedies as strongly and as firmly as you could. And I, listening to the students whose remarks had grown stronger as Shapiro brought them out, and who described it, I think, correctly, as an extraordinary test of spirit and faith, I decided that they had gotten that one right and I had gotten it wrong. Now, as we went on, in this contemporary civilization course, as I say, I tried to make each chapter kind of trial of ideas where something is at stake. It may be something someone says in class which provokes an issue, either a teacher or a student, something that's going on in my life. Many of the social theory texts, starting with Plato, Hobbes and Locke. Locke, very important to Americans because he sets up the basis of individual rights and private property that was played so heavily a heavy role in the Declaration of Independence and the thinking of Madison and Jefferson and others. As I went through that side of the two courses, and trying to think of a way of organizing this composition, I began to recall an incident that happened to me on the way to work, an unfortunate incident which happens all too often in our bigger cities. I was mugged on the way to work. Two young men stopped me coming out of the subway, and one held a pistol in my chest and the other stood behind me, and they removed $100 from my possession. That was it. I continued on to New York Magazine. Everyone congratulated me that I hadn't been, hit or beaten up. Congratulations, you've had a successful mugging. Peculiar, New York compliment. And I forgot the whole affair because I wasn't hurt. I could not prosecute because I hadn't looked the men in the eyes and didn't have a real sense of what they looked like. But when I was reading these texts about what holds a society together and what tears it apart, I started to play that relationship between me and my unknown muggers through Hobbes, Locke, even Hegel, a great German philosopher, who wrote an excruciatingly difficult section in one of his early works called Lordship and Bondage, which has been much interpreted over the years. Entire books have been written about this one passage, but I used it to talk about this relationship I had, non-relationship, what it meant, what it means for our society to have so much crime, what it does to our souls. And I said the mugging was nothing, but of course it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Not everything, but it was something, even though I didn't think about it consciously for years until I read again. Certainly I had absorbed it, and it made me more cautious, perhaps, more circumscribed in my movement. I used to have free range of my great city when I was a child. I went anywhere when I was 15 or 16, fearlessly. This was in the 50s. And it's getting much safer, by the way, and I'm happy to report, as many of our cities are. So maybe my children, as they get older, will have that same freedom that I had. It certainly had an effect on me, and I couldn't really put my finger on it until I read all these things again. Now, I kept raising my hand, as I said, and people were asking me, well, how far are you going to get into this? You're going to take the exam, or any of the exams. And I didn't want to, because I thought it's a no-win situation. I mean, what are we talking about here? I'm a professional writer. If I did better than the students, I would feel like a cad, and if I did worse, I would feel like an idiot. So, but my friends kept egging me. I could see there was something obscene about their relish. They wanted to see how I would do. So I decided at the last minute to take the first semester literature course exam, and 3 days before the exam, I noticed that my heartbeat had doubled. My palms were sweaty. I began cramming furiously. I read all the books again. I started to read some criticism and secondary material. Part of the ground plan here was not to read any of the masses of commentary. There are whole libraries devoted to each one of these books. And I thought, oh God, there's no end to that. I can't really engage it. I read a few classics of criticism, but that's it. The rest, I'll work it up out of my own responses and out of what happens in class. So I started to read criticism again in order to prepare for the exam. And here we are on exam day at the end of the first semester in the literature course. A group of nervous students from Shapiro's class stood milling about, waiting to get into the room. It was a windy, foul day in the second week of December, and a few minutes earlier, as I walked across campus, the wind had got under my parka somehow, and I felt the melancholy chill, the forlorn, dark winter day depression of a student who has to take an exam. We filed into the room, not our usual place in Hamilton Hall, but a low-ceilinged classroom in the International Affairs building with two big conference tables. Professor Shapiro, in a jolly mood, laid out cookies and orange juice for everyone, and then gave us the exam questions and a couple of blue books, the old blue books, and the old questions. Many of the characters in the works we have read this semester suffer in different ways, for different reasons, and toward different ends. Consider how and what these characters gain by their suffering and their reactions to it. Oh God. The dreariness of a college exam. Discuss the theme of self-ignorance as it is treated in 3 works you have read this semester, focusing upon both the similar and different ways, ... Yes, compare and contrast, I remember them well, the Mutt and Jeff of undergraduate life. I can't do this, I said to myself. I'll give them winged words and 3 kinds of suffering and a blast of self-ignorance, and they can shove it. I was sweating, and my heart was trying to leave my chest, so I looked up at Shapiro's students to see how they were doing. But none of them seemed at all troubled. No, the students, the children, were calmly reading the questions. This was a ritual they knew well. Henry, this is a terrific African-American student from Baltimore, stretched his muscles, turning his neck this way and that like a slugger coming to bat. And Susan, who was a left-hander, put her head down on the conference table on the right side of the blue notebook and calmly set to work, almost cradling the book with her arm, her hand traveling rapidly and surely across the lines and almost touching her face. Being examined is one of the things you become an adult to avoid. Once you pass 25, you learn how to cover your weaknesses and ignorance and lead with your strengths. Every adult, by definition, is a corner-cutting phony. Experience teaches you what to attend to and what to slough off, when to rest and when to go all out. But now I had lost that advantage. I was writing in blue books. I read the exam over and over, scribbling desperate little notes to myself. Shapiro had laid a box of Hydrox cookies at my end of the table, and I quickly ate about a third of them. After 15 minutes or so, I began writing, quote, "In Book 6 of the Aeneid, Aeneas visits the underworld and encounters the shade of Dido, who..." Even though it violated my sense of the importance of books to treat them this way, as prisoners in cells to be let out for a walk now and then, I still wanted to do well. With a ghastly groan, the rusted, ancient exam-taking machinery began to turn. But then my writing hand went into lockup. Sharp pain attacked the joint below my thumb. I was gripping the pen too hard. One of those 79-cent jobs whose ink won't flow dark and easy but comes out only slowly in a thin, pale line. I removed the pen and my hand remained bent and rigid with tension. It looked like a claw. I was used to writing on a computer, and this was torture. The students, to my relief, were absorbed in their work and completely ignored my mishaps. Shapiro, who had left us alone for a while, now came back into the room bearing cartons of grapefruit juice. Taking an exam is a grown-up's classic anxiety dream. And one thing I learned about living such an event was that it may be even worse than your dream. When the 3 hours were over, I cabbed down from Columbia to Barocco, my wife and my favorite Italian restaurant in Tribeca in Lower Manhattan, where I met my wife and a friend, and I quickly had a double scotch and most of a bottle of white wine. Later at home, still quaking, I swallowed a beta blocker, a Xanax, and 2 fingers of NyQuil. I slept, but not for long. At 5 a.m., I sat bolt upright in bed, pulling up so rapidly that I reached above my head as if to stop my noggin from hitting the ceiling. Kathy was sound asleep beside me. The children were asleep in their bedrooms. I walked into the living room where I could hear an occasional car passing on West End Avenue. In the study, I worked at the computer for about an hour. That didn't do it, however. My heart was beating as heavily as ever. Gee, I said to myself, after all these years, it's nice to find out what a nervous breakdown is. Well, that was my low point. I had other mishaps, however. I'll tell you of one other. And I'm giving you the adventure side, so to speak. I call it an adventure, even if it was a rather landlocked adventure. I didn't go anywhere except from my reading couch up to Morningside Heights at Columbia and back again. But I think I went somewhere, I hope I went somewhere in spirit. As I said, raised my hand rather more often than was perhaps seemly. And Shapiro, at last, turned to me and said, "Well, would you like to teach a little bit?" Well, I thought he was being very, very kind because he thought it would be something that would be useful for the book. I now think he was slyly setting me up. In fact, I know he was because he's written a piece for a publication called The Chronicle of Higher Education, which is a kind of trade paper for academics, kind of variety for academics, and in which he said that I was beginning to challenge his authority a little bit, and it made him somewhat nervous. So I said, "Well, teach what?" And he said, "Well, we're doing Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen, in a couple of weeks." And I thought, well, that should be relatively easy, because here we've been reading epic poems, Homer and Virgil, and Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a fantastic work, and Greek tragedies, and philosophical tracts, and at last we've gotten to the novel, and that's something all the students know. As I said, Shapiro began in this mock naive way at the beginning of classes and asked the students whether they liked the book, and it turns out the girls liked Pride and Prejudice and the boys didn't. Why do we have to read this book about these women in 1805 getting married? Well, I'm thinking to myself, some of you are going to get married too, believe it or not. But I was really angry at them. And I began teaching, and when they didn't give me the answers that I was hoping for, I began to bully them. I read passages from famous critics. I told them why this book was so important. Of course, it is a marriage story. All of Jane Austen's novels are marriage stories, but this one is about many other things. It's about perception and judgment, and how do we read other people's characters, and what kind of mistakes do we make in reading other people's characters, and why, and are we capable of changing our opinion, Pride and Prejudice. It's really about the condition of being a student. So I thought, and the best student, of course, is Elizabeth Bennet, the chattering, teasing chatterbox, who's the great heroine of Pride and Prejudice and one of the more delightful characters in all literature. So I told them all this, and I began to get more and more anxious that they get it. And I could hear my voice banging off the walls, and I thinking to myself, my God, you're beginning to sound like a used car salesman here. And Shapiro was sitting next to me, glaring at me, and after 40 minutes, he called a halt, and we went out into the hall. He said, well, did you know what you were doing? I said, I was oversteering the ship. We agreed that this was a nice way of putting it. He was too kind to say that I made the mistake that all beginning teachers, certainly in college, make, of running to the answer for fear of losing control of the class. And he said, look, the whole secret of seminar teaching is teaching small groups, and this is the glory of these courses, is that you can't just give it to them, because then they write it down in their notebooks, and they feed it back on the exams, and they never really possess it. But if you draw it out of them, you have to tease them, you have to provoke them, you can even embarrass them. Then, you know, what I've described. And then, as you pull it out of them, they will, and as they develop it themselves, they will possess it, and it will be theirs forever. So that was a great and interesting lesson in irony, of which Jane Austen is the master, of things not really being what they seem, and of rugs that one didn't know one was standing on getting pulled out from underneath one. I said I had trouble gathering my concentration at first. I did pull myself together as a reader. And after the Iliad, we came to the Odyssey, the second great Homeric epic, and it's an extraordinary work. I had no idea how exciting and crazy and wild it was. There's so much sort of aura of second-handedness and reference around any classic work that's survived at all in our media society. You know, I cannot open the New York Times without reading about a thrilling shopping odyssey down 3rd Avenue. Everything gets cannibalized, and the notion that this is just some hardy sea saga, of course it is a sea saga, but that somehow it's just like a hardy adventure is really mistaken. It is a thrillingly scary and wonderful poem. Here, it's the end of the Trojan War. The heroes are trying to get home. They're trying to get back to their wives, and every time they sit down and rest, they get devoured by some incredible beast. They're hungry, and yet they are eaten every time they relax. Either you eat or you're eaten. That's what happens in the Odyssey, and only the wiliest, namely Odysseus, survives. My concentration through that was great. It was like a novel, and I began to pull myself together. But then when we got to German philosophy, I fell apart again. And reading Immanuel Kant is like looking at a blueprint in which the passageways between the rooms are not marked. And I had to read over and over again. And reading Hegel is perhaps the hardest of all, This was the introduction to the philosophy of history, which is known as Easy Hegel. Easy for whom, I was thinking to myself. And German metaphysics is about as far from American common speech as you can get and still be on the same planet. Maybe Hegel did not come from this planet. I don't know. Anyway, to read this peculiar rolling prose, I needed to destroy so many habits that I would almost have to become a new person. Not just laziness had to be conquered, not just inattention and indiscipline. No, I would have to give up my principal vice and pleasure, daydreaming, and all its warming, voluptuous contentments. Because the moment you slip away from Hegel, you lose him altogether and have to start all over again, like a child reciting the alphabet and sent back to the beginning after a mistake. I could hardly believe it. I moved forward, backward, forward again, and at times reading the same passage for the third time, going hand over hand on ropes leading into darkness. I thought I was blind. The journalist in me, trained in intelligibility and speed, was close to disgust. This was ridiculous. I wasn't getting anywhere. The hell with this book. Well, I will now skip the paragraph in which I take revenge on Hegel by comparing him to Sig Rumen. Those of you who know the Marx Brothers movies remember Sig Rumen, a tall, rather hysterical head of the opera from Vienna, a great surgeon who the Chico and Harpo made much fun of. The desire to satirize dies hard in an American. I was amazed by the vagueness, the gloomy over-insistence, the episodes of sheer pomp. I went mad from the repetitions, the way the sentences stretched out and then folded back like taffy onto themselves. Quote, Rome itself is the fundamental object in Roman history, and it is that which guides the consideration of all events for Roman historians. But that is because the events have proceeded from this object, and they only make sense in relation to it, for their content is in it. Well, I was accustomed to the kind of thinking in which one object or force impinged on another, bruising it, transforming it, replacing it. That's the way journalists naturally see the world, I believe. And this constant motion of forces reacting back upon themselves baffled me. And what we're talking about here is the Hegelian dialectic, in which any force breeds its opposite out of itself, then fights with that force, a synthesis is reached, and then a new opposite is bred out of the synthesis, and this is the way he thinks history works, through the fighting of forces, social forces, religious forces, and so on, through time. After a while, I learned to read Hegel. The backward-forward movement of my attention became less enraging, and I would understand something and then turn back to an earlier passage that I found unintelligible. And now, understanding that, or at least believing that I did, I felt like a traveler in an exotic country who has learned to speak the language, or an acolyte who receives an unanticipated accession of faith and clarity. I would never be a natural or excellent reader of Hegel. I lacked the temperament and the training for it. But at least I was reading Hegel, caught in a profession and a way of life that scattered my attention and caused movie images to run through my head unbidden, day and night. I was nevertheless reading this bizarre, thick-limbed text, and I almost hugged myself in relief. The climber loves his conquerable rock, which makes every muscle strain. It was the happiest moment of the year. Well, I guess it was the happiest moment up to that point. The book does have a kind of plot in which it begins with my inability to remember anything, not only to remember the Iliad, but to remember my earlier life as a young man and as a child. And as we go through, I'm provoked by all of these texts, which are extreme works, many of them, and that's one reason why they've lasted so long, in the sense that they challenge one to the utmost. I'm provoked by them to reconsider my life and my relation to my parents, to my children, and so on. And by the end, memories are flooding back. When I got to Shakespeare's King Lear, perhaps Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, King Lear, as you remember, voluntarily gives up the kingship and then poses this awful test of affection for his three daughters, which of you loves me the most? Not something we should ever say to our children. And disaster ensues, because the one who does love him, Cordelia, keeps her mouth shut because she's stunned by the awfulness of this request, and the two who don't speak effusively and then proceed to destroy their father. Now, I read this great play, and I'm only giving you the bare outlines of the plot. It is an extraordinary poem as well. Thinking of my own mother, who had died a few years prior to this project. And she was a great person and remarkable businesswoman and very loving mother, who nevertheless, in her last few years, became extremely difficult in the way that Lear is extremely difficult, and demanding more love of me than I could possibly give her. And I performed on these occasions sometimes well and sometimes badly. And reading the play, I saw that, and it brought my mother's whole life into focus again. And I have written a chapter here, which was originally in the New Yorker, as several of these others were, interweaving the play with my mother's life and my relation to my mother in her final days. By the time we get to the end, and the end is now Virginia Woolf in the literature course, as I said earlier, it used to be James Joyce. Memories are flooding back, and I feel in some greater possession of myself. So I've sort of given away the plot, but not the process itself here is what really matters. Because, of course, the implicit message of any such book like this is, go thou and do likewise, and take my book with thee. There are thousands of reading groups in this country. Certainly the women in reading groups are just about keeping literature alive at this point. Publishers are increasingly sending authors out to talk to reading groups of 15, 18, 20 people, fewer even. And you could try this list or a shorter version of it. It would be certainly hard to read a 15,693-line poem alone without any expectation of class discussion, which of course is what I had and what was one of the things that kept me going on my bad days. I guess the way to do it, or you could form a group of like-minded friends and try to do one thing each month, perhaps. And someone has to play teacher, though. So it's your turn next week. We're going to read Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. It's not that difficult. It's a hair-raising work that is a complete attack on the Judeo-Christian heritage. And it sort of turns you upside down. It's a very, very exciting and dangerous book. But someone has to work up a little background on Nietzsche. It's not that hard. You can go to a good bookstore like McIntyre's and find something, or you could just use the introduction to the text. And just to get the ball rolling, play teacher, ask some questions, frame a debate. And then I think if you have a group of souls who know each other, you can start to work with that and play off each other, and you'll get somewhere. And not only that, you'll have a ball. It is really exciting stuff. The trouble with men is when they get together, they think they have to talk about politics or finance or sex or sports. But all I can tell you is that this stuff is not for wimps. It's really challenging, and it's great. So I think I'm going to stop there. I haven't talked about movies, which is my regular gig, although I guess I should say my sense that movies aren't what they used to be was also part of the motivation to get going on writing something like this. I don't think I'll ever give up movie criticism unless they throw me out, but because I enjoy it very much, and you wait for those occasional great things. And there is something I can recommend this week. We're now in mid-September, and a film called Secrets and Lies, a British film by Mike Leigh, is about to open the New York Film Festival next weekend, and I'm sure the movie will get down here maybe in October or November, and it's really something. So that's a happy moment for me. But I have to tell you, what I'm sure perhaps many of you sense also, that the movies ain't what they used to be as a art form. I mean, commercially, they're just fine. But my sense of it is that American movies peaked in the 70s, around the time of the Godfather movies and so on. What happened was, I think, that the studios were appalled by the 60s, by the convolutions and revolutions in the society, and they didn't know what young people wanted, and so they did this extraordinary thing. They turned the reins over to the directors for a while. And so you had some marvelous work by Coppola and by Scorsese, early films by Martin Scorsese and Brian De Palma, and Steven Spielberg, and Robert Altman, of course, and Roman Polanski's Chinatown, and a great many others through 72, 73, 74, 75, 76. The turning point, however, was the opening week of Jaws. You remember Jaws? And the whole country was wired into this thing. It was a media event, the likes of which we had never seen, perhaps, since Gone with the Wind. And they made what was then an unimaginable amount of money, $12 million in one weekend. Well, that now seems piddling. But what it proved to the studios was that they could wire the whole country, right? That you could use the media to come at the moviegoer from 18 different angles through promotional tie-ins and through little featurettes about the making of the movie and through an incredible number of interviews and so on and so forth. And they've all tried to recreate that kind of excitement since then, and it's been the ruination of movies because the stuff has gotten more and more sensational and crude. Not that there haven't been good movies and great movies. There are. I'm just talking in the broadest terms here. And at the same time, I think film aesthetics have collapsed because of the influence of TV advertising and MTV. You know, the cutting rate in advertising commercials on TV is very, very rapid because you're not so much telling a story as creating a mood in order to sell some goods. And the same thing is true in many MTV videos because you're creating an accompanying mood to a song. And now that kind of cutting rate is being applied to action. And what we're getting is a mess. It used to be that in a Western, say, a John Ford Western from the 50s, or an Anthony Mann Western from the 50s with James Stewart, if two guys were shooting at each other, right, you had to know, or High Noon, Fred Zinnemann's High Noon, with Gary Cooper, you had to know where they were in relation to one another so you could assess how much danger each person was in, right? That's all gone now, or it's just about gone. In other words, there was a kind of spatial coherence to an action sequence. And the studios worried a great deal about such things, and that they made people reshoot stuff or re-edit when they didn't have that right. Now it's just one exploding shot laid on top of another. If you look at Batman Forever, it doesn't make any sense in space. You don't know where anyone is in relation to anyone else. Or The Rock, say, an action movie that I have the feeling not too many of you saw, that came out. Come on, let's see a show of hands. Did anybody see it? Yeah, a few people. Okay. It's just sheer sensation. And it was all shot in the dark, and you couldn't see where anyone was, and that's not the point for kids. You see, they don't feel that lack that I feel when I don't know what's going on spatially. And there are a lot of other ways that I think things have gone bad. I mean, the foreign markets are now dominated by American movies. Sylvester Stallone is as successful in Bangkok as he is in Pittsburgh. Now, that he's a success in either place is deplorable as far as I'm concerned. But my point is that scripts have gotten simpler and simpler and simpler. That's why there's more and more action, because a car chase is the same, right, anywhere. And movies are losing their regional flavor and their chattiness, except for some independent films. I mean, there's movies from the 40s, like a dialogue comedy with Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, wouldn't even be read now. Wouldn't even get in the door. It would be considered, oh, look how thick the script is. It's much too long. We can't shoot this. Robert Towne, who wrote Chinatown, which is a great film, with Jack Nicholson from, 22 years ago, which has a very intricate screenplay, great fascination, has said that script would not be read anymore, much less made. So that's the problem. The movies are dying from success. And anyway, I'd love to answer questions either about course, books, movies, life, love. Please.
You have avoided, perhaps not unintentionally, telling us how you did on the exams.
All that Shapiro wrote on the Blue Books was, "This was very interesting." Well, I guess this is my exam paper. Yes?
You had said that you were propelled to this project by your dismay about the culture wars.
Yeah.
So what vis-a-vis the culture wars did you conclude at the end of your experiment?
Well, I have to say that when you actually read a selection of these books, the cliches of the left and the right seem completely absurd. And the notion that, say, African Americans' identity are going to be destroyed by reading a collection of great classics by dead white males, that ridiculous phrase, it just isn't true. It doesn't work that way. Identity doesn't work that way. People aren't diminished by reading great literature. The process is a struggle to understand, and you stretch yourself. You know, when you stretch a muscle, it hurts, and the blood rushes in to repair it, right? And the muscle goes stronger. And that is my observation, let's say, of African American students at Columbia. And I'm not saying that they all love the course. That's another thing. But they all benefit from the course in that process of stretching. And sometimes when juniors and seniors criticize such courses because they're required, and these criticisms jump to a general criticism of the West. It's racist, it's imperialist, it's not fair, it hasn't respected individual rights, and so on. The terms that they use to criticize, that is, they're holding the West up to its highest standards, are drawn from such books as these. So, and when I hear that, I think, then, you know, these books have had their effect. Now with women, many of the young women accept, they're far more sophisticated in many ways than the graduate students and young professors who are writing so many of the attacks on the canon. Young women are willing to accept the historical shaping of the reading list. That is, women were discouraged from heroic composition in literature, philosophy, painting, music, so on, up until about 1700, let's say. And if they did have those kind of interests, they were mocked. And their work was not copied in many cases. Don't forget, everything had to be copied until Gutenberg, right? Or it didn't last. And I heard one professor say, the truth you know, is that when the castle is burning, you save the epic poems, not the lyric poetry. So that may be a genre prejudice which encapsulates a gender prejudice. One person who was lost and survives only in fragments is the great lyric poet Sappho, who wrote maybe 150 years after Homer, was very popular. Plato, no less, said that she was the 10th muse, and statues were put up in her honor in Greek cities. And then 100 years or so after that, the ridicule of Sappho began, because though married and with a daughter, she wrote about love between women, and continued until about 1900. And that, I mean, when you look at that, the grim history of her reputation, it tells you an awful lot about the fate of great achievement by women. She survives only because she has been quoted in fragments by other writers. There is one complete poem and a great many fragments. And these are very bitter truths. And I think it's certainly a relief that there are now some women in the reading list in both courses. When I took the literature course in 1961, there were none. And so now we have Sappho, Jane Austen, and Virginia Woolf, all very great. It, of course, entails losing, since, as in all survey courses, you've got to remove someone when you add someone. It entails losing Jonathan Swift and Rabelais and, I think, Joyce or Dostoevsky, depending on who the instructor chooses at the end of the course. But women were willing to accept the historical shaping of the reading list and to say, and many of the African American students are willing to say, that yes, we disapprove of these sinful old civilizations, patriarchal, slave-holding, aristocratic, but the finest works of art from these sinful civilizations are no less precious for that. Whereas in the academic left now, they're often accused of being tainted by power in some way, as if art were the thing that were oppressing us in this country. Art is what we do not have enough of. The mass media is the only ruling discourse. In this, all this talk about a hegemonic or ruling discourse, it's quite obvious to me listening to these kids that the only ruling discourse is movies, television, video, computers. You get my point. I don't think the white males possess the cultural heritage of the West any more than the black males do, that the men do any more than the women. They are all dispossessed, these students, I think, even at elite universities, except those who come from the very best schools and are made to read a lot. Of course, one of the purposes of courses like this is to introduce them to different genres of literature, epic poem, tragedy, lyric poetry, novel, and so on. But it is also to reduce the fear of difficult and great works and to make it a lifelong habit to read them. In other words, to induce bibliomania and to get you to buy at wonderful stores like McIntyre, such that a reading life is yours forever. And of course, one reason that lists like these are fought over, and virtually everyone who's reviewed my book has said, what about Chaucer? What about Joyce? In other words, they all have their own canons. Why King Lear? What about Midsummer Night's Dream? That sort of thing. The reason there's so much arguing over it is that there's a real fear that people will not read seriously at all past this point. That is, that they will disappear into their major subjects at any college. I don't mean just elite universities, any college. And they will do specialized reading, in which they will continue to do in their professional lives. The doctors will read medical literature, and the lawyers will read legal documents, and the engineers will read their specialty, and so on. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, it will be all John Grisham for relief and pleasure. And my point is that these somewhat difficult and challenging works really are the greatest pleasure of all, that art can be the greatest entertainment of all. But to get to that point where your pleasures are much more complex requires education or a phenomenal effort at self-education. And one reason I thought I might be qualified to write this thing, I'm certainly not a scholar or qualified in terms of literary training, but is because I really believe in pleasure. I mean, as a movie critic, you cannot function if you don't believe in immediate, shall we say, shallow pleasures in some way or other. And I thought perhaps I could connect those kinds of pleasures to what you get in a much deeper way from literature and philosophy. Yes?
So then you started to touch on my question. For you, what is the relationship between the art of filmmaking and great literature, both past and current?
Wow. Well, we critics have an orthodoxy, which is that great books generally don't make great movies. Because you can never reproduce the writer's way of seeing. You can get the plot of Jane Austen right, and we've had 3 Jane Austen movies, right, in the last year or so, year and a half. And Emma, for instance, sort of reduces it to a ground plan, and it's a sunshiny and pleasant movie. And I like some of the acting very much, but you're not hearing Jane Austen's voice. And some authors great authors adapt better than others. Shakespeare does rather well because he has this kind of scenic sense of the play of forces in his drama. And E.M. Forster, in a different way, has done well because his social comedies are almost like plays. It's a direct clash that you can dramatize. The more subtle Henry James does not do well. generally in movies, and we're going to see a version of Portrait of a Lady with Nicole Kidman, which I have very high hopes for because Jane Campion, who made the piano, directed it. But I'm also worried about it because it sounds like, I mean, that is a very lovely book, but I can't see getting much of it onto the screen. Whereas second and third level novels, often in providing a ground plan of a plot, then free the director to impose his own vision. So you have a man named W.R. Burnett in the 30s and 40s who I believe wrote for the Saturday Evening Post and wrote a lot of westerns and so on and gangster things, and no one took him very seriously in, you know, the way they took Faulkner or Hemingway or Fitzgerald or Edith Wharton or Willa Cather seriously, but he provided the ground plan for a great many good movies. And so I think I would stick with that formula, but you have to be very careful at how you apply it. Movies do certain things very well. Obviously, they give you it's a sensuous medium, gives you the look and the feel of things. It's a fleshly medium. It's a sexual medium. Literature is much more reflective and much better at handling complex groupings, and at much better at bringing one back to oneself. In reading a novel or a book, you have an encounter with your own destiny that is very, very striking. That movies don't do that for you. I think we're about running out of time now, and I wanted to thank you all very much.